Welcome to the 2022 Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum Summer Seminar Series. We are very blessed and delighted to have Eric Furm with us this evening, who will give us a fabulous presentation on the images of God from a mathematician's point of view. The image of God, some thoughts on the topic from a mathematician and scientist, Dr. Eric Furm. On the sixth day of creation, as reported in the first chapter of Genesis, God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." Why does the Bible have God speaking in the plural case, us and our? What insights into God's image do we find by examining who we are and the self-images we gift to the world? What glimpse of each of our beings enlightens our image of God? Biblical scholars categorize these views in three general categories: views that serve to resemble God, views that our interpersonal relationships reflect divine images, and views that God's divine image is manifested in our representation of God in our actions in the world. We will review how artists and authors have portrayed God's image and how they fit into these categories. This is one mathematician's introspective view of his image of God in the modern world, and that is what he will present to us. The image is of Marie Curie, with the idea of what if she were to start a chain reaction that would change the entire universe and the life as we know it. Eric Furm is an applied mathematician specializing in fluid mechanics and shock physics. He earned his BS in mathematics and chemistry from Boise State University in 1976 and earned his PhD in applied mathematics from Washington State University in 1981. For 31 years, he worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory on fluid problems and design and analysis of dynamic experiments. He blew things up. He worked in many groups at the lab involved in explosive applications, safety, and design, as well as working for several years in the proton radiography program. He retired in 2012. Eric has used his free time since retirement for traveling around the world, barbershop and chorus singing, enjoying being a grandfather and other family gatherings. Eric was raised in the Episcopal Church and was a member of Bethlehem Evangelical Lutheran Church for the 35 years that he was in Los Alamos until he relocated to Fort Collins in 2006, where he is now attending Plymouth Congregational Church. He was trained as a Stephen minister and Stephen leader at Bethlehem Evangelical Lutheran Church and has worked over the last 2 years to help create a Stephen ministry team at Plymouth. Eric was a founding member of the Los Alamos Faith and Science Forum until he resigned in 2016, having relocated to Fort Collins. COVID protocol has allowed him to rejoin the forum via Zoom, and he has been involved in the forum for the last 2 years. Eric has always enjoyed science and finds enjoyment in reading and studying topics on history and philosophy of science and religion and the intersection between them. Please join me in welcoming Eric Furm with his discussion on images of God in the Bible, art, and in our scientific world.
So this is Michelangelo's painting on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. And I was there 8 years ago or something like that. And some people get to go there and have it all to themselves. I was there, this room is big, the Sistine Chapel is bigger than the cathedral in Boise, the Episcopal one that I grew up in. So, you can put 1,000 people in there. And there were 1,000 people in there probably when I was there. And there was a guy up on the podium or up at the altar saying, "Silencio, silencio," the whole time I was there. So that image had a little bit of noise background to it, but it's a beautiful room with images like that describing the Bible. And I take the first chapter of Genesis and look at what's going on there. And it said, "Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon this earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image, he created them, male and female. He created them. So the words I highlighted there, I thought were very interesting. God creates humankind in our image. He's talking about himself in the plural. When I talk about myself in third person, people wonder about my sanity. When God talks about himself in the plural, what's he mean? So it's God's apostrophe, not God apostrophe S. That's really the point here. There's not one image of God, but many images of God in one image, perhaps. God could be like a complicated gemstone with many facets, and each of them has a unique view. Perhaps each of us has a unique view into this God crystal, and everyone gets to see his own perspective of God.
That's pretty good.
Can we understand God better by sharing what image of God we see from our own unique perspectives? That's a question I'd like to talk about tonight. What glimpse of God do we see when we look in the mirror? So when I grew up, I grew up in Episcopal church, and I had many images of God. And the list of words there are sort of Lord, Creator, Good Shepherd, the I Am, Father, King, Jesus, Savior, Trinity, Holy Ghost, Jesus, and Father, and Judge, and Healer, Helper. Late in my life, I was probably out of graduate school when I ever heard a sermon talking about God as mother. It was probably on Mother's Day, I suspect. But even when I look at the first chapter of Genesis, a lot of that looks a lot more like a female God to me than maybe he's an engineer, but maybe he's a mother, or she is a mother, I guess I should say. So, and then I take artwork. When I was growing up, there was a picture, and it was a gray-haired guy in my parents' bedroom, and I think it was an image of God, I think is what it was supposed to be. And he looked like a gray-haired grandfather sort of image, and maybe like up on top of the Sistine Chapel. But the images I sort of remember are like the Good Shepherd story, and that comes out of Psalm 23. So the Good Shepherd's really the Lord, right? God, some in the Jewish sense of the word. And on the other hand, that looks a lot like Jesus to me in that image up there. And I think, I understand that. The great I Am, there's a picture of the burning bush out of which the I Am comes. Judge, I found this image of the God up there separating the goats from the sheep. That's one. There's this, when I didn't read the Narnia stories when I was young, but I did read them to my girls when they were growing up. And that's a nice set of stories created by C.S. Lewis, talking about Aslan, who's a Christ-like figure in the story. But, literature, I think, is another piece of art that's important. Back in the good old days, a lady wrote him once and said, "My son likes Aslan better than he likes Jesus." Oh my God. And he wrote back and said, "The Narnia stories are not an allegory. They are a representation." And Aslan is Jesus in the world of Narnia. And, you know, it's sort of interesting that there was a time that you write authors and you get letters back. So perhaps that still happens, but it was news to me. And then probably 2 years ago, Dominic Crossan wrote this image up at top right. I put the sheeps and the goats in here, so I had to give you a happier image. Crossan wrote this book on resurrecting Easter. And what he's doing is comparing images of the resurrection as seen in Western Christianity,
Hello?
mostly Catholic churches, and in Eastern Orthodox churches that Victoria is going to talk about next week. And in the Eastern tradition, you see these pictures, and this is what happened. So Jesus dies on Good Friday, he's resurrected on Sunday. What happened in that comma in the creeds? You know, he died and was resurrected on the third day. What happened in between there? Well, in the Orthodox traditions, Jesus goes to hell, like it says, and he breaks down the gates of hell. And here he is lifting Adam and Eve out of hell. That's what's represented up here. And so he's taking everybody out of hell already. We're already saved, according to these pictures, which I think is an very interesting book if you want to get that. Alrighty, so, and then I just need to say, you know, we all go through trauma in our lives. And there are times when you want to have a God that's accompanying you, that's strong. And I understand that. And I understand wanting to have a powerful God. So, you know, God who ultimately calms the tempest that they sailed into. You know, you got a ship, you want to have a captain on board there. You know, you think of the hymn, I'm a choir boy, so you think of the hymn about Jesus piloting us through life, or eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms hath bound the restless waves. You know, a God that, you know, I know that you're in trouble, but I'm with you and I'm accompanying you. And if you have courage, we'll get through this together. You know, that's a nice, comforting feeling. And that's also part of the image of God. You know, even in the Episcopal Church, a mighty fortress is my God. It's good music, you know, I mean, it tells you that God is there to keep you safe. So the fellow at the Faith and Science Forum here has used the image of God from the Sistine Chapel fairly often. And perhaps we've maligned it, I don't know, but they're sort of fun. You know, here's God creating the universe. And here's God touching the scientist rather than Adam, giving him that inspiration to look for research into how the world works. Or we've got God playing dice. Einstein said he didn't play with dice, but we found him. He does play with dice. And I even found this image. I'm afraid that we haven't ever used this until I found it. But, you know, maybe she touched Adam a little bit. So my mom was born in 1917, and she really liked chemistry. And I think one of her favorite people was Madame Curie, sort of an inspiration for her. And I sort of wonder what would have happened if Michelangelo used Madame Curie as his model for the Sistine Chapel. Is it so hard to see she guided the spark to start the chain reaction of chemicals in some remote corner of the universe which led to life. You know, isn't it nice to have an image of yourself sometimes in there? Anyway, just something to think about. So there are a lot of perspectives of how we are created in the image of God. There's a large literature on this subject, and I'm not really doing it justice because this is a little bit more oriented towards how I see it rather than how the academics look at it. But there's sort of three ways of thinking about these perspectives. We resemble God in the qualities and characteristics or endowments. You know, we have a spiritual nature. We use rational thought. You know, we do rational calculations of how things work. So we have a rational nature. And we're relational. We form relationships with each other, with nature, with spiritual beings. Then there's possible views of interpersonal relationships that reflect the divine image. Our ability to engage in complex relations with others in our communities. And then there's views that God's divine image is manifested in how we interact with the world, what we do, stewardship of the environment, or the nice quote is, when you did it to one of the least of my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. It's a quote from Jesus. So. And I've sort of touched on this already, usefulness of the image of God. Why do I worry about this? Last week we had a Buddhist discussion on Buddhism. And, you know, they were talking about how you meditate and think about the world and think about suffering. And you meditate on it and then you come to a conclusion. So the image of God is sort of a pathway to relate to the spiritual, but it's also a person to talk to. It gives you an image of somebody to have a conversation with. And perhaps that we do that through prayer. You know, when I'm thinking, I tend to talk to myself even. Should I hide myself? But, you know, when you put something into words, when you do research, you really don't know the answer until you write the paper of that research. Because in writing that paper, you find out that you didn't cross all the T's. And so I think, you know, prayer, when we get further along here, you'll wonder, well, do I pray? And prayer is a way of communicating to myself sometimes, but speaking to God having God there to speak to is a way to put words to thoughts. And sometimes if you don't put words in there, you don't have you're not getting the thought complete. So, and then perhaps it's an ideal to strive. And I think you could probably add to this a list a lot. So what do I see in myself as part of God's image? My perspective is that I'm a scientist, I'm a mathematician. You know, I'm an individual human being. I've had family, you know, normal life like all of you. I'm a scientist. I look for explanations of natural phenomena. And I've done that my whole life. You know, I was a pretty curious kid even. And I know what I can't explain, but then it becomes part of the quest of my life, perhaps. Some of them more than others. As a mathematician, I study structures, relationships of abstract structures. You know, group theory is just transformations of one group onto another group and how that all works. And I've done graduate work was on fluid mechanics, and it's basically evolutions of dynamic systems. And I could talk to you a lot about that if you want me to, but probably shouldn't. So when I hold up the mirror to my life images, which image do I use? And what contributes to each of these images? You know, I mean, in reality, you know, the cell just after fertilization is sort of what sparked this whole process. Is that Eric? It looks very incomplete to me. Okay. Is it this young kid? That's probably 5 or 6 years old or something like that. Or is it this guy going out to sing Valentine's or singing Valentine's on Valentine's Day? Who knows? Well, let's take a closer look at all these guys. Is that all there is to inheritance? We fertilize this egg and we let it grow. Well, that, you know, started from a fertilized egg, but there's DNA contributions from my parents, and that's a jumble. I've got brothers and sisters that don't look very much like me. So there's a process there that makes us all unique. You know, there's genetic contributions from 4 grandparents. There's genetic contributions from 2 to the n+2, great to the nth grandparents. So you go back a few generations and there's a lot of people contributing to who I am in just that egg. Not only that, Glenn talked about epigenetics 4 years ago, you told me. It's longer than I thought it was in this forum. And epigenetics is the fact that if you stress a living creature, its DNA gets imprinted a little bit from that thing through not the genetics, but maybe turning off some of the genes. You can put hydrogens on there and things like that, or other chemicals in the cells. And that changes what genes are actually activated as you're going through that. And so if the mother is stressed, that happens. If the person is stressed, that happens. And then there's a safe womb, which shares more of the epigenetics effects, and then some amazing transformations occur. So topologically, that one cell becomes a torus with multiple holes in it, if you think of the mathematics of it. The cells differentiate into different tissue types. You know, a liver cell isn't the same as a lung cell or a heart cell or a muscle cell or a skin cell. All those things are different, all coming from that same one cell. Pretty intriguing. Okay. And after a long process, we become an independent persons. So is that all there is? Well, I would say I was raised in a loving family. I had older siblings that helped. There's my family with my father, mother, and 2 sisters and 3 brothers. I had older siblings to teach me the ropes. You know, my oldest sister taught me how to use a slide rule back when I was in 5th grade. Whole bunches of crazy things. I have an obsession with slide rules, by the way. I've got more slide rules than anybody should have. Younger siblings that I played with, interacted with. I had 13 years of education. That's probably more than 80 teachers more than 1,000 students in those classes, fellow students. So you interact with all those and they help teach you, right? Teaching somebody else in your class or learning what their mistakes were, all those interactions are very important. I had 9 years of college education, so that's probably another 100 professors, more fellow students, development of colleagues, and living and interacting with society and the community. You know, it sounds a little bit PDQ Bach-ish, but I think the University of North Dakota, I think it's Southern North Dakota or something like that. The math department up there has a genealogy of math thesis advisors. So I can trace back my thesis advisors and, you know, let's see, Prontal is a famous fluids guy, is on my academic list. Von Karman is on my academic thesis advisors genetic list, if you want to call it that. So is Gauss and Leibniz. Of course, you know, I mean, Gauss is probably on 3/4 of mathematicians in the world. If you go back far enough, you'll find those guys. And probably all of us are on Euclid's list, you know. So anyway, is that all there is yet? Well, there's more learning and living. There's influence of the, I've made influences on the future, I believe, because of my involvement in the world, involvement with my family, my career, and my community. What will or will not happen because I took it my actions. So it even goes out into the future. So is that all there is? You know, before I was even born, before anybody was born, we had to create a universe. A universe had to be created from an apparent point source. And it developed, stars evolved, planetary systems evolved, somehow life was formed, regenerating chemical reactions of some sort, you know, and then cellular behavior, evolution. I don't know all the answers to this thing, but all those things had to happen before I could be here presenting this talk to you today. Or you'd be here, you're being here to hear this talk as well. So here's a mathematician's view of an image of God. And I'm happy that you all have images too. This is my image. I don't want to portray it onto you folks. You don't have to believe this, but it's sort of how I look at it. I am the realization of an infinite number of
Stupid
events
laptop lost the
since the
internet
beginning of
connection.
time.
I couldn't get it
Some of
back.
them are remarkable.
It happened several times.
Absolutely, you know,
So now I'm watching it
all
on
of
my
them
cell phone.
are highly improbable. You know, even the fact my parents got together. You know, my dad grew up in Pueblo, Colorado, and my mom in Silver City, Idaho, and somehow they got together in Aberdeen, Washington. You know, who would have thought? You know, throughout my lifetime, I've affected this world and the universe in some small ways that will affect the future outcomes of myself and others into the future forever. I don't understand the physics of each event in the past, nor will I understand the physics of all events in the future. But I will pursue understanding those events. Part of the image of God that I see in myself is that I'm an accumulation of an infinite size set of past and future events that result in the realization of the human we call Eric. So the truth, I struggle for metaphors. The proper metaphor or simile. I don't know if you want to call it a simile or a metaphor. Barbara Brown Taylor's written a book recently that describes it as a luminous web of interconnectedness. That all these people are interacting with each other. All of nature is interacting with each other. Teilhard de Chardin, forgive my French, I guess, describes the noosphere and the omega point, with love being the driver to the point, or maybe a strange attractor. Love is a strange attractor that will ultimately, I look at myself, if you look at a rope, you go down and then there's one little fiber in there. And I think of myself sort of being one of those fibers, interacting with a whole bunch of other fibers, maybe all of you. And, you twine them together and you get a strong structure. And, that's sort of my image. One strand in a rope of time, or a minor facet on the infinitely faceted gemstone we call God. Anyway, that is the image I can offer for you now. And it may change in the future, but that's today's story. So here's some references for the Luminous Web essays on the science of religion by Barbara Brown Taylor. Chardin's got whole bunches of books out there. All of his books were published posthumously. He left them with a secretary because the Pope wouldn't let him publish any of his works. And the secretary apparently didn't have that restriction. And they're all translated out of French. I think they're very challenging to read. And I don't know if they read better in French, but for one thing, he never got a chance to edit them. So that probably is part of it. And then if you look at Proverbs, chapter 8, there's a section in there of wisdom's part in creation. And it sort of echoes a little bit of what I've said here. And then one of the ladies at the church made this up just recently and asked, what is your image of Jesus? And, your image of God ought to resemble you a little bit, but that means it's got to resemble all of us a little bit, right? And it's really good if we can stand out our image of God so everybody's included. And anyway, what's your image of Jesus look like? It's her question. Well, here we go. She, or maybe he, or she, he, or they, or whatever, are there touching Adam, starting this all off way back when. What image of God do you see within yourself? How does your image of God influence your walk through life? That's another question you might want to talk about. Do we see a reflection of God when we look at each other? That is sort of a description I use for the Holy Spirit. Is that we're a reflection. Each of us reflects the facet of the gemstone to everybody else that we meet in life. Whether that fits with your definition of the Holy Spirit, I don't know. But that's how I image it. By sharing our images, my hope is that I gain insight of views. I presented mine, and I look at it, there's a lot of science. If you want the world to start off 10,000 years ago, I know how to do that. I'm a mathematician. I did initial value problems my whole undergraduate career. You can set everything up as at 10t equal minus 10,000. We had photons flying in the middle of space. that appeared to be coming from a star that's someplace. And I can create that situation, and then I can evolve that forward into the future. But as a mathematician, I also look at that initial value problem and say, I can back that up. And it looks like it came from a point source. And I guess I don't want my God to be fooling me. I don't think he set things up so that it would appear like the age of the universe is billions of years old, but really it was only made 10,000 years ago. Now, if that is what you want, I can understand that. I can set that initial value problem and give you that world in theory. But I keep asking the question, well, what was before that? And so I keep asking questions, and it inevitably puts me farther back. So that's my answer to you, Gary. I don't know if that answers it or not. So any other questions, or should we go to table conversation? Thank you all. And I appreciate you coming and listening to me.